Hi, Richard and Diana.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us on ASAP Art. Can you tell us a bit about nanolabs and how its origins and how your engagement with film has changed over the years?
I'm going to start with the last part of your question first. Uh, how our engagement, or my engagement in particular, I'm going to answer it for myself, has changed over the years. And the answer is not a great deal. And this came up in my mind actually in the last session. I was thinking about it. Sometimes people refer to the kind of film practice we do and that many other people participate in using terms like nostalgia. And I don't understand it as a concept because we've continuously been doing it. Um, it would be like having nostalgia for driving in a driverless car age when you're still driving. You still do it. So in that sense, I think it hasn't changed a great deal, at least for us. Where did nanolab come from? I mean, nanolab is a number of different things. One thing it is a commercial film processing lab. It came about of necessity because Kodak changed the film stock options for Super 8 filmmakers, and it was no longer possible to get Super 8 developed in Australia. And we needed that. We needed Super 8 processing. So we started doing it for ourselves, and then it just took off because we were the only people doing it. So that's where it came from. But what nanolab is bigger than just that commercial lab. It's where we work as artists, and it's also or we like to think of it as a kind of resource for the region. Not so much in terms of being a processing lab, though it is that, but rather being a kind of resource for information and context regarding experimental film. So that's kind of much bigger than what nanolab is, and at the same time it's much smaller because nanolab customers are doing all sorts of things, whereas we're in particular involved in experimental film, which is only a small subset of the work that nanolab does, but it's a big area of our engagement um, extending from nanolab outside. So a lot of people think about nanolab in terms of the experimental film stuff, but in terms of what happens on a day-to-day level at the lab, it's mostly more pedestrian than that.
So, you've spoken about your films as being handmade or do it yourself. I was wondering if you could share a bit about your process and your general approach to filmmaking.
In terms of process, we like to think that in making our films, we're making something along the lines of visual music. So we like to think in terms of there being musical structures, of there being concerns that are not specifically conceptual or idea driven, but that are about the experience that you'll have as you watch and listen to the film.
Yes, it's a phenomenological concern, a perceptual concern, an experiential one, more than conceptual ideas driven, as you say. So we very much come out of that tradition, but that tradition is rather broad. Our version of do-it-yourself and handmade, it's literally true. We literally do everything. We tend to focus on doing things in quite a sophisticated and cleaned and technically correct way, perhaps, in terms of the lab work. Part of the handmade film tradition is to make a feature of that kind of handworking and in the sense that it emphasizes the materiality of the process and what have you, and it emphasizes the process, the work, the doing. That's only evident in our films some of the time. Some of the time we take a very tactile approach, an approach that shows the tactility of the process and of the materials in the films. But usually our films, the handmade aspect of our films is slightly unnoticeable. Yeah.
I guess this ties in with our idea that machine work is the new handwork. So that a lot of the explorations are exploring how to use the machinery of the film technology, which in the past artists didn't really get to use, the kind of big heavy things that labs owned, like the contact printers and even optical printers were limited to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, unless you were in a very unusual situation, you didn't have access to these things. But yeah, you're right. When we think about the handmade aspect of our work, we're really contrasting it with the alternative that exists these days, which is the kind of software-centered production methods, right? Which are, I mean, you could describe them, fairly or unfairly, as extremely abstract in terms of what the maker understands about what's going on inside the machine. Whereas one thing that this digital world has revealed, at least to us, is how comprehensible and human machines are. You know, the kind of modernist move was, fear or at least anxiety or something to do with the mechanization of humanity. But still, mechanization seems much more comprehensible and human by comparison to what we have now, which is so abstracted from us that we don't really understand it. We become much more we to a much greater extent have to have faith that the thing is going to work, whatever it is, in whatever field it is. It's like it's being put there by gods or something like that. We spend a lot of time with our hands inside machines fixing them. That's a significant part of like what we do when we tour around. We work on people's old equipment, partly because we love that stuff, partly because it's central to the kind of thinking that we have in terms of the process of our filmmaking. We're interested in the permutations and variations that we can get out of the apparatus, the mechanical side of cinema. But when I say the apparatus, I always mean the machine-brain combination. What this thing does that produces the flickering, what it does to our brains. So I don't want to ambiguate the idea of the machine in that sense. I sort of think of us as in the machine. And that's partly coming back to Diana's point about the humanness of the machine. Because we can look at a piece of equipment and understand it and think about what else it could do and how its parts connect to each other. It's a bit abstract as an idea unless you've had the opportunity to play with some of this filmic stuff. Our experience, however, is that we can look at a 1960s or earlier machine and kind of work out what was intended by it, what the engineers and the people who conceived of it had in mind, and how it was going to do the thing that it does. And therefore, we can quite readily think about what else it could do, how to bend the machine, how to kind of reveal its possibilities and its limitations. So that's a much fuller and more rambling idea of what we mean by handmade film. However, it's also literally true. Like we just do everything in the lab. Yeah.
I feel like that humanness of the machine, it actually made me think of self-portrait with a bag, because the idea of a mistake, that idea of what could be thought of as a mistake, which is that you wanted to protect the film, but actually reveals this beautiful film, which is also serendipitous in a way, because you have all these images that appear on that film. So I was kind of cute, and I also really enjoyed the textures in China, Not China. Because I feel like both these films have an interesting relation to light and time, which is essentially, if you think about film, that's how meaning is also made. So can you tell us a bit about this ductility that you're talking about, and how some of these are, yes, they're experimental. How much is serendipitous? How much is not?
Because with Bag, while it started with, sort of one fleeting image, it then became a real
Pursuit?
Yeah, a very vigorous pursuit, because there was, I think, at least 200 attempts. um, just on different days with different lighting setups,
Yes.
and to finally get like the handful of images that are then worked up into the film. It became a kind of obsession that, like, if this one thing had been possible when I wasn't trying, it must be. And in the end, even I was able to do the titles in this same way by just placing the film directly in the bag.
Mm. Yes, it certainly was initially serendipitous, but these sorts of things, happen when you play with this stuff, and if you notice it, then you can try and explore it further. In terms of process, that's always our ambition, to discover something in the world that's interesting and try and bring that out, as opposed to conceiving of something in a study or a bedroom or something like that. We feel that it's likely to be more genuine if we bump across it in the world. And that's certainly what happened with the first experience of this image appearing from just advancing film in a black cloth bag, realizing that that there could be images produced that way was then very exciting. In terms of time, you raised the question of time or the temporal aspect of that film. Um, One thing that's quite interesting, or for us, what's interesting, is the way this machine, the projector, or the whole apparatus, but the projector is the kind of final expression of the apparatus, creates an illusion of movement. Normally, in the history of cinema, the idea is for that illusion of movement that it creates to be kind of the same, or pretty much the same, as a movement that actually occurred, such that the apparatus becomes invisible. We're quite interested, though, in the mechanics and the kind of psychomechanics that are involved in the creation of that illusion of movement. Um, so many of our films are at least engaging, or I was going to say playing, I like the word playing, with that illusion making process outside of just, mimesis, just reproduction of something that was in the world. So in the bag film, there was no camera, there was no movement, but you experience movement. Movement comes from the collisions of the spacing of the little images, the little pinhole images on the film, when interpreted by that device, the projector, which cuts up a continuous strip of film into discrete little frames and then flickers them on the screen one after another, such that your brain is stimulated by them, and your retina holds on to it to some extent, blending them together and creating this experience that we have. There was no actual time in self-portrait with bag. There was no. The only time exists is during projection. Yeah.
Yes, for each exposure, because they're very tiny holes. And to make it work, I had to have the film in the bag somewhere quite dark, but I had to have direct light landing on my face. And so they're quite long exposures. It's actually held for some seconds, but it's not exposing just one frame at a time. There are 5 or 6. So then and so they each see it on a slightly different angle. So there's this strange pulsing of movement.
The little window, the little film window on a Super 8 cartridge is about that big, which is 6 frames. Now, 6 frames, depending on what speed you play it back, is something like a quarter or a third of a second. Each of those frames has different images on it. They've been put on the film at the same time, but they're going to be experienced by us through the interpretation of the projector in a certain order. And that creates collisions, which we experience as movement. Let's talk a bit about China Not China with regards to time as well. I mean, that film is very much about the temporal and about impermanence and transformation from one thing to another, if so much as our films are about anything. But the process of making that film involved, like, each shot that you experience, which might last for, say, 20 seconds, would have taken a couple of hours to make. So it's blending that downwards into 20 seconds. You're seeing pretty much all of that 2 hours. Or actually, you're probably seeing moments from that 2 hours put on top of each other. So there's definitely gaps. It wasn't filmed at a normal speed. It was filmed in a slight slow motion, such that the experience you have is kind of out of time. Yeah. Once again, it's not using the camera in the way, or the whole apparatus in the way that it was intended. It was intended as a way of reproducing or imitating, or reproducing, I think is better, an actual movement that happened in the world. This film uses some of that movement, but what you're experiencing is much more complex than the simple event that happened, because it's a whole period of time compressed in each shot.
Okay, I'd also like to go to the film In and Out the Window, and also to Intersection, because I think both of them are also doing interesting things with the sound design, especially. So if you could tell us a bit about how you imagine, because when I was watching the film, first I thought it was like a clock, and then it begins distorting, and then it takes on different meanings, and then you also feel like, again, it comes back to time in a certain way. And I feel like there is a certain sense of humor also in a lot of your films, and I felt that especially with Intersection, because of the sound design. It kind of puts you in that space where you're in a liminal space, and you're also enjoying this movement. And I felt that the sound design contributed to that experience in both those films, especially. So, if you could tell us a bit about your process in terms of designing for the films, when you think about, since you've spoken about your philosophy of like working with sound and poetry in your films.
Yes, an interesting thing both of those films have in common is that they are films that concentrate on something you normally just look past. With the window film, the window is just there. You open it, you close it. You don't really think about it.
You look through it.
You look through it, in fact, yeah. But then we start to just completely make it about the window and focus down on that. And with the Intersection film, it's these moments when you're just waiting for the traffic light to change, or these kind of discarded moments that you experience. And so the sounds are both the same thing too. Like when you're practicing music, the sound is a metronome in and out a window. And when you're practicing music, you don't really want to listen to the sound of the metronome. It's just there to help you count. It's another sort of discarded sound. And with Intersection, these are editings from people speaking, where all the ums and ahs and discarded
noises,
sounds are taken out.
Yeah, I mean, we find it funny. I'm glad other people do too. Humorous, I should say, because there's no jokes in it, but the drawing attention to those aspects of speech where people are trying to hold your attention by inserting a word like because their brain is ticking, but they're not ready to spit it out yet. But they want to keep you because they want to keep the sort of attention. So that was what we were thinking about in terms of constructing the sound, because those moments at the intersections are very, very distracting. But I mean, obviously, primarily the film is concerned about things to do with movement and shape and form and rhythm. And the sound, is trying to support that, support those experiences. So it's not conceived of like the soundtrack is not separable from the film. The soundtrack is very much in a support role. Similarly, the soundscape in the window film, which is just a metronome, but it's being played with. Diana's, manipulated it and done things with it, but it's just a metronome. You can't really listen to that on its own. But in connected to the film, it then, has we've created a situation, I think, where we can listen to the metronome, where we can draw attention to it. And I find that kind of interesting too, that music can be made out of stuff that, I mean, like thinking in terms of music, because their soundtrack's not really music, but music can be made out of the things that you're meant to look past. I mean, in many respects, many of our films are about that, are about noticing visual or other experiential things that are actually quite interesting, but not normally, attended to.
How those experiences are different from, let's say, having an instrumental track that does something else, but you're using sounds from the world around one and then creating that experience.
Yes, and I'll just say something, because you used the word instrumental track. We would not do that. We wouldn't do something that was like a piece of music, because this would lead, and we want the sound to be supportive. Sometimes we think about our soundtracks as being analogous to, they're not literally this, but analogous to a band of musicians without the lead musician, without the singer, or without the, whatever the main instrument is, but it's backing. Yeah, and such that the form that you engage with is the form of the images and its structure, and the sound is helping cue and support that, but is not leading it.
So, also as part of the festival this year, you guys organized a workshop on Chromaflex, which is a process of color developing. So, can you tell us a bit about the process and how you developed the workshop or imagined it, and how it went also?
Well, the history of the Chromaflex workshop, we were really looking for a workshop, I mean, that is fun and that gives you something you can watch at the end of the day, but also that gives you a way to see what it is that darkroom chemistry does in the light. To let you, because so much of people's questions about, like, how does this work? What is this? What's going wrong with my process comes from the fact that they can't see what the chemicals actually do. So we tried to come up with a way that you could, like, do it completely in the light and see, like, I see this is what this one does. This is what that one does.
And I mean, it's also a workshop that points to the wondrous nature of color chemistry. I mean, it's quite surprising what it can do, the way it can be invisible and then visible. I won't go into what I'm talking about there, but just suffice it to say, taking a black and white image, for instance, and putting it in various baths of chemistry in the light, and then putting it in some color developer and seeing color emerge out of nothing is quite wonderful, I think, and a good experience for people to see where this stuff comes from. It's also a very tactile workshop. I mean, you're doing something that's very much like a little animation on a strip of film. That animation is in the form of putting tape or other things on the film surface that will block chemistry. So the chemistry that you put it in until you take the tape off won't go onto those bits of the film. And this allows you to select which parts of the film are going to be chemically treated in which way, which I think is also interesting, because the end result is something that very much feels like a handmade thing. You can see the person putting the tape on or putting the nail polish on and then taking it off, and all of the artifacts of that. So that's quite a nice aspect to it. Chromaflex is something we came up with maybe 10 years ago now, and it was born out of doing a relatively similar thing with black and white film, and people kept asking, can you do this with color? And we would repeatedly say, no, it's not possible with color. But then we gave it some thought, and we worked out a way using a few hints of information we have from, film books that tell you how soundtrack recording is done, or not recording, how soundtrack developing is done on 16mm films. Now, this is esoteric information, but there was a little clue in the processing sequence that is used in making soundtrack prints, color prints that have an optical soundtrack, that made us realize, there's something in that sequence that could be played with. So we did a lot of experimentation to work out the Chromaflex sequence, and it only works with a certain kind of film. But, it's an enjoyable workshop, and it went well, I thought, the version of what we did here. The nice thing is that you can really get a lot of people involved, in fact, the more, the better, because you get more to see at the end of the day.
So you've actually also been to the Emami Art Experimental Film Festival last year as well. But I was wondering if you'd share a bit about being at the festival and your experience of being there.
On the one hand, love being in Kolkata, and I love the tea. This festival is quite interesting. It's only 4 years old, which is relatively recent. I mean, it takes a lot of effort to run something for 4 years. But what's interesting is after 4 years, it's standing out in the landscape of experimental films as a noticeable event. It's one that people apply for. And I mean, they had a record number of entries this year. If you get over 1,000 entries for a festival, it started to have an impact on people. So I think that's proof that it's, hitting some nerve. It's of interest to people.
Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Pleasure.